You're about to witness the unraveling of one of British Columbia's most perplexing mysteries, the case of Madison Scott. In 2011, she disappeared from a campsite that remained eerily untouched, like a frozen snapshot of a normal night turned nightmare. Her truck, her tent, her purse with money, all perfectly preserved. But Madison was gone. Stay with this story as I'll guide you through the strange circumstances surrounding Madison's disappearance and the desperate search that followed. The mystery that left the community in anguish, searching for answers that seemed just beyond reach. If you've ever wondered how someone can vanish without a trace while camping, or how evidence can remain hidden for years despite thousands of people searching, you're about to discover the haunting truth. Join me for another odd, mysterious story here at Odd Mystery Stories. What happened in the final hours before Madison Scott vanished? The answer might chill you to the bone. The evening of May 27, 2011, started innocently enough. Madison Scott and her friend Geordie Bolduc arrived at Hogsback Lake, excited about the birthday celebration ahead. About 50 people had gathered for the lakeside party, creating what should have been a fun, carefree night under the stars. But there was already one small hiccup. The friends realized they'd forgotten their tent poles and had to make a quick trip back to Vanderhoof to retrieve them. It was a minor inconvenience that would later take on a much darker significance. As the night progressed, the atmosphere at Hogsback Lake shifted. The crisp air filled with laughter and conversation until midnight, when the mood dramatically changed. A fight erupted among some attendees, turning the celebration into tension. In that sudden shift from celebration to conflict, everything began to unravel. The sounds of merriment gave way to angry voices and hurried goodbyes as many partygoers packed up and left, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they drove away. At around 1:30 a.m., Geordie decided to abandon their camping plans. Madison had already been comfortable and warm in her sleeping bag for some time before Geordie's announcement. Madison pleaded with her not to go, her voice carrying across the now quieter campsite. Perhaps she sensed something wasn't right about being left alone in the growing silence of the forest. I told her to come with us, Geordie later reflected, the weight of those words evident in her voice. But she was already settled in her sleeping bag and didn't want to leave her truck and tent unattended. Madison, warm and comfy, decided she would stay tucked into her sleeping bag with the sounds of the forest growing louder around her. Had she made a fateful decision to stay alone while everyone else departed? The last confirmed sighting of Madison came around 2:45 a.m. She was still inside her tent as the remaining partygoers left, their voices growing fainter as they moved away. Witnesses reported offering Madison rides, but each time she declined. What thoughts raced through her mind as the campsite emptied, leaving her surrounded by darkness and the distant calls of night creatures? Those who knew Madison described her as vivacious and sociable, someone who thrived among people. Her brother noted that she was equally staying at home wearing a dress or work coveralls, adaptable, outgoing, and quick to join activities. This makes her decision to stay alone puzzling. Why would someone with her personality choose solitude in a remote campsite? One detail might explain it. Madison wasn't intoxicated that night. She had been texting her father until shortly before the party ended, suggesting she was alert and making conscious decisions. Perhaps the familiar shape of her truck in the moonlight and the security of her belongings created an illusion of safety. As night stretched towards dawn, Madison remained alone at Hogsback Lake. Her truck stood silent nearby, her belongings undisturbed in her tent. The space that hours before had hummed with conversation now echoed only with the sounds of wind through the trees and water lapping against the shore. The remote forests of British Columbia have swallowed people before, leaving families with unanswered questions. Now, Madison was alone in this wilderness, with no one to witness what happened next. The most chilling aspect of Madison's final night wasn't the party or even her decision to stay. It was how circumstances converged. Forgotten tent poles, a midnight fight, a friend's departure, and Madison's reluctance to abandon her belongings, leaving her completely vulnerable in the darkness, where anything could happen without a single witness. The next chapter in Madison's story reveals perhaps the most unsettling contradiction of all. How could a campsite look so utterly normal while its occupant had vanished without a trace? Even more troubling was the 24-hour window where multiple people encountered her abandoned belongings, yet failed to sound any alarm. Morning came to Hogsback Lake with no indication of the mystery unfolding. At around 8:30 a.m., Geordie returned to collect belongings she had left behind, having left Madison alone hours earlier. What she discovered should have immediately triggered concern. Madison's tent was unzipped with items pushed to one side, but no sign of Madison herself. The scene resembled a movie set suddenly abandoned mid-filming, everything in place for someone's return, yet eerily vacant. Yet in a decision that would later haunt the investigation, Geordie simply gathered the things she had left behind and departed. She was in a rush to get to work, and perhaps assumed Madison had just stepped away temporarily or found another ride home. This casual departure created the first critical delay in recognizing that something was terribly wrong. How could something so ordinary looking mask such an extraordinary absence? That same evening, as Madison remained missing, approximately 150 people gathered at the very same location, drinking and celebrating, while Madison's white 1990 Ford F-150 truck sat locked nearby, her tent still erected. Throughout this entire gathering, not a single person questioned why these belongings remained abandoned or why the young woman from the previous night was nowhere to be seen. During this second gathering, someone actually flattened Madison's tent. A young man attending the party, perhaps drunk or simply careless, damaged the very structure that might have contained vital evidence. Yet, even this act of destruction didn't prompt anyone to consider Madison's whereabouts or why her possessions remained unclaimed. By Sunday, Madison's parents grew increasingly concerned after not hearing from their daughter all weekend, an unusual silence from someone who regularly kept in touch. Driven by parental instinct, they made the drive to Hogsback Lake. What greeted them confirmed their worst fears and marked the beginning of a nightmare that would span years. They found Madison's truck locked and abandoned. Inside the vehicle, her purse still containing money, eliminating simple theft as a motive.
Hi, I'm calling. My daughter is 20. We're at Hogsback, and I haven't heard from her since Friday night. And we just came out, and our pickup is here in the vehicle, and people haven't seen her at all.
Okay, what's her name?
Madison Scott.
And what's her date of birth?
April 29th, 91.
So she was last heard from on Friday?
Friday night, yes.
Okay.
All of her stuff's here, but yeah, I don't know.
Where does she live? With you?
Yes, with us in Vanderhoof.
Does she have a vehicle with her?
The vehicle is here, yes. We are out at Hogsback. I talked to her Friday night, and then we just haven't heard from her yesterday, and her cell phone has been dead.
The truck has been there all the time?
The truck, yes, it has been. We're at the truck and the tent right now.
And no answer on her cell?
No answer. It's been dead, it seems, since yesterday.
The scene presented an eerie contradiction that investigators would struggle to make sense of. Her campsite looked like someone who intended to return at any moment, frozen in time like a photograph of an ordinary life suddenly interrupted. Initial police statements indicated there was no signs of struggle at the campsite, which only deepened the mystery. If Madison had been taken against her will, why was there no evidence of resistance? If she had left voluntarily, why abandon everything she owned, including her truck and money? What makes this case particularly unsettling is the inventory of what remained versus what had vanished. Nearly everything Madison owned was left behind, except for two crucial items that she would have had on her person: her iPhone 4, with its distinctive teal case, and her truck keys attached to a Gothic-style lanyard. The forensic evidence told investigators what seemed impossible. Madison had literally vanished while everything else remained perfectly in place, creating a scene that resembled a normal life paused mid moment. Even more troubling was the realization that throughout an entire day, dozens of people had walked past Madison's abandoned belongings without recognizing them as evidence of something terribly wrong, creating a 24-hour blind spot in the investigation. The blind spot in those critical first hours would soon give way to one of the most extensive searches in British Columbia's history. When a town of just 4,400 people mobilizes with helicopters, cadaver dogs, and sonar equipment, you'd expect that they'd find something, anything. Yet, despite searching an area larger than some small countries, Madison Scott seemed to have simply evaporated from the face of the earth. As news of Madison's disappearance spread through Vanderhoof, the community's response was extraordinary. Within hours of her parents filing the missing persons report, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police established a command center at Hogsback Lake. Search and rescue teams fanned out across the rugged terrain while volunteers arrived in droves. I didn't even know Madison personally, recalled Terry Wilson, a local contractor who spent 2 weeks searching. But seeing her parents' faces, I couldn't just stay home knowing a daughter was missing. The search area stretched nearly 2,800 square kilometers of dense forest, rocky terrain, and cold, murky water. This vast wilderness, from Fraser Lake to Alpierre, became a physical manifestation of the community's growing fear. How could someone vanish so completely in a place where everyone knows everyone? Helicopters with infrared technology swept over the forest canopy, while specially trained cadaver dogs worked methodically along the shoreline, capable of detecting human remains even underwater. Despite their sophisticated capabilities, these searches yielded nothing but mounting dread. The Scott family transformed their kitchen table into an impromptu command center, with maps spread across the surface marked with search grids. Dawn Scott would often collapse in tears while planning the next day's search routes. Every morning I wake up thinking, today will be the day that we find her. She told volunteers during one particularly difficult briefing. Their initial $15,000 reward grew to an astounding $100,000 as weeks turned into months, reflecting their desperation and determination. At least 150 volunteers distributed flyers throughout the region. Madison smiled, gazed out from the posters in gas stations, restaurants, and public buildings across British Columbia. The message was clear. Madison Scott would not be forgotten, and her family would never stop searching. The annual poker rides became a community tradition, starting in 2012. These events kept Madison's case in public consciousness while raising funds for continued search efforts. Picture dozens of riders on horseback or ATVs navigating the very wilderness where Madison vanished, scanning the ground for anything unusual that might finally provide answers. As months became years, frustration grew. The RCMP conducted extensive interviews with everyone who attended the parties at Hogsback Lake, chasing down thousands of tips, yet investigators found themselves in the baffling position of having no confirmed reports of unusual activity near the lake that night. The absence of leads created a psychological pressure on the community. In Vanderhoof, everyone knows everyone. The unsettling reality began to sink in. If Madison didn't simply walk away, which all evidence contradicted, and if no outsider was observed in the area, then the person responsible might be someone local, someone who understood the terrain, someone who knew the party, perhaps even someone who was there that night. Imagine living with that knowledge, that the person responsible for your friends, your neighbors, your community members' disappearance might be someone you pass on the street or chat with at the local grocery store. The uncertainty created invisible fractures in the community, whispered suspicions that couldn't be proven, but couldn't be dismissed. Those invisible fractures in Vanderhoof's community weren't just internal wounds. Beyond the whispers and suspicions amongst neighbors lurked an even darker possibility that few wanted to acknowledge. Just miles from where Madison vanished runs Highway 16, a 450-mile stretch of remote roadway that earned its chilling nickname in 1998, the Highway of Tears. Since the 1970s, this lonely ribbon of asphalt cutting through northern British Columbia has claimed over 40 women, their disappearances forming a disturbing constellation of grief stretching across decades. Vanderhoof bears its own painful scars from this infamous highway. Bonnie Joseph vanished without a trace in 2007, leaving the community shaken. 3 years later, Lauren Leslie's murder deepened the town's collective trauma. As recently as 2023, the nightmare continued when Chelsea Quad disappeared in October, only to be found dead a month later. This relentless stretch of road devours secrets and lives, leaving families forever searching for answers. Each disappearance carves another wound into this small community of 4,400 people. Each loss forces residents to question, is there a predator moving among them? Or, perhaps more terrifying, are there multiple predators drawn to this remote region? Madison's case aligns with this broader pattern, yet stands distinct. Consider the circumstances. A young woman alone at a remote campsite, miles from help, with no immediate witnesses. The perfect opportunity for someone with predatory intentions. Imagine being targeted by someone who knew the party location and realized you would be alone. One investigator noted, this theory suggests Madison may have been watched, her vulnerability assessed by someone who recognized the perfect opportunity when her friends departed. Unlike most Highway of Tears victims who vanished while hitchhiking, a necessity in remote communities with limited transportation, Madison had her own truck. She wasn't walking the highway or seeking rides. She was at a campsite where safety should have been guaranteed. The distinction matters, especially to the Scott family, who resist having Madison's disappearance labeled as another of the Highway of Tears statistics. When cases merge under a single umbrella term, individual details fade from public attention. The family likely feared that as another of Highway of Tears' victims, the urgency to find Madison's specific perpetrator might diminish. Authorities have never officially linked Madison's disappearance to the Highway of Tears phenomenon. Yet, Hogsback Lake sits just a short distance from this infamous highway. The timing echoes other disappearances, and the method, a young woman vanishing without witnesses, mirrors too many other cases along that lonely stretch of road. Law enforcement has quietly investigated the possibility of a serial killer operating in the region. The pattern raises disturbing questions about predatory behavior, potentially undetected for years. Remote locations, vulnerable victims, limited police resources, and communities reluctant to connect separate cases have created ideal conditions for a predator to operate undetected. Despite massive searches involving hundreds of volunteers, despite reward money reaching 100,000, despite extensive media attention, whoever took Madison evaded detection, suggesting someone familiar with the area and possibly even with police investigative techniques. The shadow of Highway Tears stretches across Madison's case, representing the darker reality of remote communities where women can vanish without immediate alarm, where distance creates vulnerability, and where predators might operate for years, unseen and uncaught. The predator who took Madison Scott may have operated unseen for years, but secrets buried in rural British Columbia rarely stay hidden forever. On May 29, 2023, exactly 12 years and 1 day after Madison vanished, the RCMP made an announcement that sent shockwaves throughout Vanderhoof. Human remains had been discovered, and they belonged to Madison Scott.
It's taken 12 years, but today there was a major break in the disappearance of a young woman in northern BC. The remains of Madison Scott have now been found.
The 12-year mystery had cracked open, but the answers that emerged only spawned more questions. The timing haunted the community. As Vanderhoof marked the somber 12-year anniversary of Madison's disappearance, investigators quietly moved in, executing a search warrant on a rural property approximately 18 kilometers from Hogsback Lake. Picture it: officers stepping cautiously across unknown terrain, their faces tense with anticipation, the weight of a 12-year investigation hanging in the balance. What finally led them there? The RCMP has remained tight-lipped, their silence a wall between the public and whatever breakthrough finally pointed them to this location. For 12 long years, hundreds of volunteers had walked through miles of wilderness. Search teams deployed sonar equipment and helicopters with infrared capabilities. Yet, Madison's remains were discovered on a property within reach the entire time. How could this location have evaded detection during one of British Columbia's most extensive searches? The area has been secured, and additional resources will be on scene for as long as necessary, the RCMP stated in their press release. The words themselves reveal little. The silence around the property owner, the condition of the remains, and any recovered evidence creates a vacuum filled only by questions. Even with this discovery, the case remains strangely unresolved. Corporal Madonna Saunderson made it clear that foul play had not been ruled out, suggesting something suspicious about where and how Madison was found. Yet no arrests, no named suspects. The case broke open while somehow remaining locked shut.
In 12 long years, and it's comforting in some ways to know, but obviously thinking of Maddie and missing that part of our community.
Yesterday, RCMP revealed a major breakthrough in the case, announcing they found Scott's remains. They won't say where or how, but they say they have a search warrant on a rural property west of Prince George.
Vanderhoof responded with collective grief. Over 1,000 people, nearly a quarter of the town's population, gathered to honor Madison. The municipal flag flew at half-mast, acknowledging their shared loss. For 12 years, Madison's disappearance was an open wound. Now that wound has changed form without healing. While finding Maddie has yielded some relief, it has generated many other questions that remain unsolved. The Scott family stated, "They finally know where their daughter is, but who took her there? How did she die? And perhaps most haunting of all, who knew where she was all this time?" Consider the contradictions. Someone owned that land. Someone had access to it. In a small community where everyone knows everyone, how did her remains end up there without anyone noticing? If the owner was involved, how did they escape scrutiny for over a decade? The RCMP continues to seek tips from the public, suggesting crucial puzzle pieces remain missing. The search warrant, rather than responding to a reported discovery, indicates specific information pointed them to this property. What information? Why did it take 12 years to surface? We don't know if the property had been searched before, where the remains hidden, buried, or exposed. We don't know. Were they in a building or some remote corner of the property? Still, we don't know. These details speak to intent, to whether Madison's body was deliberately concealed by someone who believed it would never be found. The 18-kilometer distance from Hogsback Lake suggests disturbing possibilities. Close enough for someone familiar with the area to transport Madison quickly on the night she disappeared. Close enough to have been within the search radius. Yet, far enough that a connection to the party might not have been immediately obvious to the investigators. Even after so many years since her disappearance, Madison Scott's case still haunts Vanderhoof like a persistent shadow. Even with the discovery of her remains, critical questions remain unanswered. Who took her life? Why? And how? The Scott family continues their pursuit of justice, maintaining their $100,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Meanwhile, the RCMP investigation remains active, still seeking that crucial piece of information from the public. The truth about that night at Hogsback Lake remains hidden behind the veil of silence. What secrets of that fateful evening might finally heal a community's open wound? Your theory could be the missing piece that brings closure to Madison, her family, and an entire community still waiting to heal. Please take a moment in the comments section below to share with all of us your possible theory on this story. Thank you. Hey, thank you for joining me in another odd mystery story. If you enjoyed this story, you might also be interested in the story of the mysterious disappearance of Tammy Lynn Leppert. You'll find the link to that story in the upper right corner of your screen. Your support helps keep these stories alive, giving the affected families the hope they seek. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already done so. And for those who'd like to further support the channel, be sure to check out our online store for exclusive merch and more. I appreciate you. Thank you.